Sean Robertson, lead artist. Pat Oliver, audio director. We'll leave Pat's picture up there for a minute while I just tell you what we're going to do today.
Thank you. Thanks for doing that, Julian.
Hey, he didn't get the joy of being up there for 10 minutes last year. We're here today to talk about what makes for a really successful bad guy. And we're going to walk through the process of building some of the signature BioShock Infinite bad guys. Some of them are pretty creepy, and some of them are pretty interesting and new, and we're going to talk about what went into decisions to build those guys for gamers like us. We're going to show some concepts that didn't make the cut, and we're even going to dig into how Irrational uses sound to bring some of these bad guys to life. And we'll try to leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end before they kick us out of here to answer your questions. The good news is the panel after this got canceled, so even though it says 12:30, it doesn't mean the panel's half over. We're going to be able to run for a normal time. Before we dig into the first bad guy we're going to deconstruct, though, I kind of wanted to open it up to the panel and ask sort of one overriding question, which is when you're sitting down here and you've got a level, you've got a concept, and you know sort of some basic story you want to tell, which is kind of where we were last year when we were talking about this, and you're going through the cast of characters, the bad guys that we're going to face, and you've got all of these lists of different things you want to accomplish. How do you know when you got it right? How do you know when you've got a bad guy that's going to work in the game?
It's definitely one of those things. I mean, it sounds a bit cheesy to say, but sometimes
speak up.
when you see an image, you know it's right. There's a general consensus, and these directors, like sometimes when the image comes up, I can point at the voice of someone's image as one example where we didn't really do too many revisions of that. It just, the image was there, I brought water through it, and we all took a look at it, so that's it. That's amazing. What can we do with that? Not all creatures have that moment. Some take a lot more blood, sweat, and tears to get going, but you know, there are the occasional moments where you just have a general consensus, like everybody on board, let's go, let's do this.
And do they tend to evolve a lot as you're building the game out?
Certainly, the other creatures that we have do have a lot of evolution. You know, a lot of breaths as we go through. Like, this isn't working. We got to change this.
Sure, because even if you see that picture, for example, in Voice of Silence, you get that picture and you're like, oh man, we absolutely have to do this guy. But you know, it's sort of a case of you can look at a picture of a pretty girl, but that doesn't mean you get to date her. You know, you actually, as soon as you start trying to get some of these monsters in the game, you learn a lot about them and how they're going to have to change to be fun, to be scary. So there's you start with what's on paper, but then there's this massive evolution as you go.
So let's just dig into our first one. I want to start with this image that you guys showed me, and I haven't talked to you about most of these images, so I'm curious where they come from. This was the first image that I saw of what became the motorized Patriot, that sort of George Washington guy with a giant machine gun. It doesn't look a lot like this, so who can
No,
so
Sean did this. This is one of the first drawings I did for BioShock Infinite. And you look at the time period that we're dealing with, automatons were actually kind of a big thing back then. There's a lot of source material to draw from. And there's the reality of the automatons, which were these really, really creepy looking people that had plaster faces, and we had one motor that could do one thing, you know, like pull a card out of a slot or something like that. And then there's the fantasy of what, you know, those people at the time would really have liked to do with it, which was, you know, creating these robots and automatons that could do things for you. So when we started playing around with the time period and knew that we wanted to go there, we started looking at automatons, and if you had unlimited technology at the time, what could they look like? And at this point, we're not even thinking about it as somebody that we're going to give a gun to. We're trying to build a vibe, and you know, like what's the history behind these things before they even get going.
And this idea sort of stayed around. I mean, you drew this probably 2008 or something.
Yeah, really around.
And we didn't have a motorized feature until 3 years later, so because it's one thing to have an idea of, oh, we want an automaton, but then how does it thematically tie into what you're doing? And I think that's the struggle with everything we do. We can't just come up with a sort of creature in isolation. It has to sort of fit the narrative, fit the visual space and the aesthetic and all that stuff. And so there's a lot of ideas that, you know, some things happen right away, like was the sound of the front pages of the cinema. years and evolved a bit.
Yeah, this image actually specifically comes from, it's kind of interesting to see this again because it was so long ago. This comes from a time in development when we just sort of go to our desks and start spitballing. We all draw, because we don't have a great sense of exactly where we're going yet. So this is an image that comes out of that time when you're trying anything, you're trying everything, and it's just the beginning of the evolution.
So this was sort of a second, I'm guessing here, but when I was looking at these images, I was sort of trying to piece together how this might have flowed. This was sort of the second image that I saw in this evolution of the motorized Patriot, where it seemed like this one had gone from sort of this feat idea of a gentleman to something that was starting to look slightly more creepy. What was the genesis of this version of the automatic gentleman?
Well, I don't think we actually had an idea for the function of him at this point. We just really liked the idea and just sort of let it run. Sometimes you come up with, oh, we need a monster to fill this gameplay role, or this, to be scary in this way. And sometimes you just keep riffing. This is artist Rob Waters. So, Sean planted the seed, we planted the seed of talking about these automatons, and he just kind of ran with it. There was a lot of iterations, literally hundreds of this guy, doing different things. In some cases, when we were Stormy, the darker Stormy game, which you may have seen clips from I think we showed last year, this guy had a huge weather vane on his head and could conduct orders and use that as a weapon, and we just tried a bunch of things.
This guy in particular, actually, the bottom guy that we bought, we were playing around with the idea of a town choir at the time. So this would be a guy who, fictionally, not that even when you're actually playing Bioshock, you don't know what time it is, but fictionally, as people are walking around town, this guy would have the time for people and be able to tell, be informational, so that we're building a history for him before we make him a monster.
And then it seemed like that's when you gave him this thing. Right?
You always need one of those, right?
Right, and the next evolution was this guy, right, who seems like has that town crier thing going on, right?
He's a town crier, blow up doll sort of thing.
So what Ken, when you're looking at something like this, which is starting to seem like a pretty evolved concept, right? The guy's walking around with a gun on his chest, nice and creepy looking. You look at something like this, what makes you think, it's kind of where I want to go, kind of not where I want to go? How do you move from here?
Well, the challenge with a guy like this is, and look, I want to say a lot of this evolution happens just by, Rob Waters will sit there and just keep drawing. And sometimes, he'll just sit there and come up with ideas that allow without any feedback at all. And I think he just kept coming back, and he's got an incredible amount of perseverance. I think that I would him like very frustrated because he just keeps generating these beautiful images. But for me, I just didn't know how this guy. I love the look of him, and I didn't know how he fit in the world. I didn't know what his role was, and that's always the challenge: is how you integrate. How do you integrate these ideas? And so we sort of go back to him, and we say, hey, that's not exactly right. But generally, a lot of times we don't know what to tell him what to do. And he and Nate will talk, and Sean will talk, and they'll just keep evolving the idea. But look, probably a lot of the times is that I don't really know what I want at all, and so I don't envy his job. He's just got to keep at it, keep at it.
Right, and then we go from we go from this to something that starts looking a lot more like what we saw in the trailers, which is this kind of George Washington-looking guy who starts looking really creepy. Is this about when you start realizing, hey, maybe we actually have a place for this guy in the game?
Yeah. This is sort of the image right that he started to turn a corner, and then the question was, he had the macro idea, then it gets down to the details. And something that I think that really came along in this guy. My mom had this doll when I was a kid that came from her. Her mother was probably born, her mother was probably born around 1900, I guess, my mom's mother. And she had this doll from when her mother was a child, that her mother handed down to her. And it was a porcelain doll that's probably made around 1904 or something like that. And we kept it in our dining room in our house. And that thing scared the fuck out of me. It had this porcelain face and those glass eyes and these rosy cheeks, and it just sat there like this. And I remember I had a dream one night when I was about 10 years old that I saw this doll sitting there, and I came down and I looked at it, and it was sort of looking away, and then all of a sudden the doll was like this. And oh my god. And this fucking thing was in my dining room. And so I had a sequel dream where the dog killed my mother. And
Oh my God.
went on and on, and so I'm still my mom still has this thing, I'm still and when we started sort of, one thing that I wanted to get is that porcelain, kind of cracking porcelain feeling. I always thought that was really this uncanny valley kind of vibe. And this is what this is what I saw when I walked by the thing. It was, it's a little cute little girl doll. So, all you can do is you try to tap into a bunch of things. You try to tap into the themes of the world, what's going on in the world, but then you try to tap in, because all you can do is like, what freaks me out, what scares me. And I think of all the images in my life, that was probably the thing that scared me most, was this little doll, which makes me quite the manly man.
So you start looking at stuff like this, which seems like a really evolved concept, and you've got notes to sort of future artists about how to do things like pucker the eyeball socket and things like that. At what point do you take it from being on paper to things like this, which start looking like almost instructions to animators, right? And how to get this guy into the world and moving around and doing things. I mean, is that always part of this process, or is it sort of after you've decided, yep, we're going to do something with this?
No, I mean, Rob, it's definitely one of the great things about Rob is he really thinks mechanically about these guys, and he'll give you an earful about how he thinks it's supposed to animate. So he's definitely over there talking to animators, and he'll be over there miming stuff a lot of times. So if you go back to slide 13, I think you talk about the evolution. If you look at this, and he has the basic elements of what he has now, which is a flag and a machine gun. But if you look at where we went with him, like we really wanted to push the patriotic feel. So instead of the tiny flag he holds in his hand, he's got two giant flags that stick out and change his silhouette. So that we're getting our stride here with what we want to say with this guy, but it's not really fitting the aesthetic yet. So there's that final leap of, okay, I think we're getting all the elements here, we're just not highlighting the elements that we need. The creepy mask, the patriotism, the bright sunny day vibe that we're going for in Bioshock Infinite. Once we get there, then Rob's out there, doing his blueprints for us and constructing this. And these are his notes as much to the guy who's actually building the model as it is to the people who are in himself.
Right. Another thing, if you toggle between 13 and 14, that I think goes to sort of what our topic is today, which is, if you see one of the main iterations that caused the change, sort of the delta from 13 to 14, is we wanted the functionality to be both more visible, right? We wanted to see sort of how it worked, because we think that's more interesting. The other thing is, he essentially is a malfunctioning version of himself in the game. And we talk about fear or what generates fear. If you think of Hal or Ash or Bishop, there really isn't anything quite as scary as a malfunctioning robot, because there's nothing back there, right? Malfunctioning robots scare us in the way serial killers scare us, because we know that there really is nothing, there's no heart in there, there's nothing ticking inside. So when they come at you, you know that they're not going to stop, absolutely not stop until they kill you. And, I think that's one of the things he accesses. If he was a perfect working version of himself, it probably wouldn't be quite as scary.
Right, and that gets us to the really creepy version, right? Which this guy's definitely not factory spec. Is the idea here that you break this guy down?
Yeah. Well, this is the concept of when you start shooting him.
Well, I remember there was a documentary. If you ever been to the Hall of Presidents at Disney World, I think a lot of inspiration for this guy came from that. You have these sort of very kind of stiff, autonomous figures. But then I remember watching a documentary of the 50s, a film from the 40s, not the 40s, the 50s, early 60s, when they were actually making these things. When you take sort of the mask off and you see sort of the workings underneath, it's kind of scary, because they're weird looking underneath all that stuff. They're just a bunch of gears and levers, because they're not, they've got a challenge of getting all these hydraulics, of getting all this stuff packed in this box where they don't care about the aesthetics. And seeing sort of what's behind the mask I think is always a good place to start to get sharing.
So let's look at where this ended up, right? This is a clip from the footage that we've sort of seen online. And clearly here he's in pretty good shape. He's got the flags behind him, etc. How do you go about integrating this guy into the world? Because I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition between this guy, who's clearly not your friend, and this, which sort of seemed like poster art. that I imagine is a way we might encounter this guy in the world before we see him or after we see him, to give him a sense of what his true purpose might have been. How do you start integrating these guys into the backstory?
Well, it's always there. Like, I think it's actually the opposite. We integrate these guys into the backstory before we really think about what they are as a quote-unquote monster. These posters exist to tell the story of what they did in peacetime. I mean, the same way that Rosie in BioShock 1 has a rivet gun because she was one of the people that helped, she or it or he, was one of the people that helped build Rapture. And that's where that's why you have a person in a diving suit with a rivet gun walking around Rapture. It's the same way we look at this and we think about the function of this robot was to spread patriotism, to be the mouthpiece of Colombia for the citizens before things went crazy.
I think people probably think that storytelling is a lot more direct than it actually is. Like, until actually a couple of weeks ago, I don't think I really closed the loop on this guy's role in the world from a narrative perspective, and it's mostly because it's a dialogue that happens between, the artists and the level builders, and all these opportunities come up, and if you're not there and you're not sort of hungry for those opportunities, we had this level, which we haven't really talked about yet, where the motorized patriot, we first meet him, and he was just sort of there. Like, he was like, oh, and then this robot comes out and starts shooting at you. And I didn't really understand thematically why I was there, and sometimes you have to trust yourself, and you get in this really weird place where you're like, he's there, but it just feels like he just feels tacked on, and I sort of knew his purpose, I knew his role in the world, but why was he in this space? When you met him, when you met Sandra Cohen, you knew why he was in the space he was in. When you met Steinman, you knew why he was in the space he was in. But before Steinman was Steinman, he was just this doctor, and then you start figuring out what is his purpose here? Why does he live here? What does he want? What's his goal? And finally, actually, it was really about a week and a half ago where I think we really closed the final loop, and that's because it's not just sitting there and staring at the wall. It's Nate will come up with something, Sean will come up with something, or have a sound effect, or Rob will do a new image, or some programmer will come up and say something. And that's the joy of working on these games, is you're surrounded by smart people, and you get to go to work every morning. And these, I know there's gonna be 1,000 violins playing for me right now, but making games is hard work. And there are a lot of times you come to work, you're like, oh my God, do we have any fucking idea what we're doing? Because you have this, you look back at this track record that the company has, and you kind of go, well, do we really remember how to do any of that? Because it gets very opaque, very murky, how you go down a path. And the way to do it really is just to not worry about it, and to trust that if you're surrounded by really smart people and you have enough time, you're going to come up with something that's interesting. And because there's no overlord sitting over this, figuring this out and passing it down. It's a bunch of people collaborating and just sort of figuring it out as they go along.
So let's move on to a different image. Let's talk about the handyman for a second. Again, you guys were generous to drop me a whole bunch of artwork on the handyman, and most of us probably saw him in the trailer for the first time, and he's kicking your ass the first time you see him. And this is the first image that I got to see of the guy, which is not exactly the most threatening thing. I mean, to me, this is a sad picture more than anything. I mean, what's the thinking behind creating this kind of, I don't know, ecology for the guy before you even got into the game?
I was lucky enough to have a chat with Guillermo del Toro on our podcast, and one thing he said that I thought was really brilliant was that a good monster is a monster you can imagine in repose. And what I think Guillermo meant by that is that the monster has to have a life besides wanting to fucking kick your ass. It has to have a story, and an existence besides what he means in that gameplay moment when you encounter him. And I think that's what makes great villains in general. If you look at, whether it's what's a Delusion's character in Gangs of New York? Butcher, seeing him in his environment, in his milieu, before he's fighting, before he's killing people. Seeing villains need time to develop and need time to breathe, and to get there, as game creators, we can start imagining, what this guy's story is. We're not actually going to talk about what this guy's story is today, because it's not like you waited an hour and a half to see a panel, you want to learn anything interesting. Because I'd much rather you guys sort of encounter it in the game, because but figuring out these images really help us sort of evolve, a sense of this guy's life and a sense of what he's doing when he's not attacking.
Yeah, and I think for us, it dates back all the way to System Shock 2, that I think even though we may start with different intentions, we always end up injecting some amount of pathos into our monsters. If some older members of the crowd have played System Shock 2, you remember that our sort of rank and file enemies, the hybrids, would actually apologize as they were attacking, because they were so half-conscious. Even though they were taken over by the many, they would both attack you and apologize, because they were literally being animated to attack you. And, it started there for us, and I think in every enemy we found that little bit of, you can also feel sorry for our enemies as they're killing you. That's an important thing.
I think I remember writing that AI video for that character. An AI video needs it's sort of taglines for a monster. And generally they're not, they're like, flank him, get him, go around the back. And it's the hardest thing to write because it's so boring. And I remember starting to write this guy, and I was looking at him, and he's just, this 120 polygon character. And I was like, how can we make this interesting? How can we make this character interesting? And then I remember just the word run, came into my head, and that this guy would actually warn you about himself, and their sense of that shame, and that sense of that he's fighting within himself, which is that one word, and that gave these guys a life beyond what their 120 polygons allowed. I think that set for me as a writer, set the tone for a lot of for System Shock, for Bioshock Infinite, for how to think about AI videos and how to make them more interesting besides just the information that they project to you.
So I want to move, and we won't linger too much on this, but I wanted to look at some of these sort of early pictures of the handyman and how you're sort of trying to keep that pathos in. And I looked at the images like this and the previous one, where you sort of see him in this quasi-cowering position. And I was wondering, from an animation and an AI perspective, it's one thing to draw a character that looks sympathetic or give him sympathetic lines. How do you go about actually making the guy act sympathetically in environments like this?
Certainly from the animation side, Pat and his team did this amazing treatment of the handyman, in the world, and coughing is really wet type of cough, and we heard that, and we immediately wanted to do an animation to fit that, and it was one of those cycles where we do the animation and it feeds back to the sound department. It's definitely one of those moments where working across departments, when you start to actually get this character moving in the game, it really helps get the creative juices flowing.
And Ken talked about how the Motorized Patriot didn't really have a home in the level that we were introducing him in. One of the ways I think that you develop that sense of empathy for an enemy is really about how you introduce him. Because once he's been introduced as a game mechanic, his storytelling powers kind of go out the window. He's now about, he's really now about somebody who wants to kill you and you want to kill him. So you have an opportunity when you're introducing these guys to just inject, that's really what your narrative window is.
So just a couple more quick pictures, because I just think people may enjoy seeing them. Again, like we saw with the Motorized Patriot, I sort of thought of this as the parts sheet. Right? I imagined getting this guy in a box and trying to build him as a model. Is the intent here to really be sort of creating a reference diagram for everybody who's going to be in?
Well, it's funny is we never asked Rob to do these. He just gets so pissed when people model his monsters wrong. So he'll do 8 pages of this, and down to the tiniest detail. And I've seen things where he actually goes and gets reference of what the head of the screw should look like.
He'll build it as a skeleton.
Yeah, but I love this one where we're looking at the actual finger proportions of each knuckle to each finger, right? I mean, I wouldn't expect to see this in concept art as much as I'd expect to see it in the first model.
Yeah, sometimes you'll get a difficult mechanic and he'll just build it in sculpting. He'll plop it on the modeler's desk and say, here, this is what you're doing wrong.
I mean,
This is fun.
I mean, do you ever need to get to the point of like doing it almost like you do film, where you're doing full maquettes and stuff like that, or does the digital world give you so many more tools to do that?
Yeah, we can do 3D maquettes like much more quickly, and we can iterate on them more quickly. But sure, we effectively do that. And drawing systems are very hard. So,
And in case anybody missed it, this is where we ended up. This is as we see him in the game, looking a lot less sympathetic to me, honestly. So I wanted to move on to some of the newer bad guys, if you will, ones you guys have just started showing. I wanted to talk about the Siren. Right, the Siren is the last one that you guys did video on, and she's this diaphanous creature who hovers over the battlefield. And this is the image you guys gave me to start with.
Looks like a fun guy.
It doesn't quite look like that. So I was hoping someone might give me some context.
Well, again, you know, when we're doing these sketches and looking at concept art, you're trying to figure out how does this guy fit into your world that you're creating. Because concurrent to this, you're building levels, you're doing environment concept art, you're actually building environments, and you have the whole story arc that you're trying to tell. So this guy might work great in another game or another story, but in the story that we're trying to tell, we start going through these things and say, this guy really doesn't fit the feeling that we're trying to get across with this particular person or this particular level. So it could be, you know, something as simple as that. Like, it's just not right for where we want to introduce this character.
Yeah. I mean, one thing we have is that we try to limit the number of supernatural elements in the game. We try to like basically say, make one logical leap in each game. And Rapture was, you know, there's this genetic technology. Yeah, there's a city at the bottom of the ocean. So, but, you know, at least that's, you know, conceive that you can sort of see how that could potentially happen. Because once you just sort of throw the rules away, I think you start losing people because they can't buy into the world. So we wanted like people to be an enemy. So like we have this desire from the design team to have a character who raise people from the dead. But how does that fit into what we're doing? And we start getting all these images of like these, you know, very fantasy-like characters magically raising people from the dead. And that, unfortunately, how do we tell that story? How do we make people, how is that consistent with the world we're trying to create? And a lot of times we do that just by, you know, and poor Rob, we're not telling him how to do it, like we don't tell him where to go with it, but he just keeps sort of throwing ideas down.
And yeah, this is one of his ideas. This is sort of like, or the previous was, he was sort of like a Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And he would, you know, he had stigmata on his hands, which would shoot blood and raise guys up. And it just, you know, it wasn't really a fit for the team. Interesting idea.
It's a great image.
Yeah.
But so then you make this logical leap to not have it be Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God, but instead this performer. You know, and how does that? I guess how does that make it a better fit to the world at that point than Jonathan Edwards?
Well, you know, as you evolve it, you're still thinking about like how is she? There's two other things you have to get. She has to look cool, and she has to look interesting, and she has to look different than every other